evolution produces original selfishness? Yes. But also evolution is a benign force leading to progress. Yes, that's true too. Both are true.
Even the highest academies of religion have never heard of the Urantia Book. Should we remedy that, and how should we remedy that?
Our next speaker is Byron Belitsos. Though Byron is a well-known speaker to the Urantia Book community, this is the first appearance at a scientific symposium. We are so glad to welcome him. Today, Byron is going to present a topic that has its roots in his undergraduate days. I think he told me that. And his topic is the problem of natural evil in biological evolution, how the revelation solves a theological predicament. Welcome, Byron. The platform is yours.
Thank you so much. What an honor to be here. The problem of natural evil and the role of chance in biological evolution. I've added the role of chance, and that's a pretty big part of this discussion. So the subtitle, How the Revelation Solves a Theological Predicament, and we'll get to what that predicament is. This is adapted from a book that I'm now working on to be published by a company called Whip and Stock. They're a academic Christian publisher. They acquired my thesis that I wrote at Union Theological Seminary in New York. See a picture of it there. And I went to this place after retiring, or sort of semi-retiring. Several years ago, I wanted to get a master's in theology. I also wanted to begin to do some research with academics on the Urantia Book, knowing I probably wouldn't get very far. So it was a big experiment on an experimental planet to see if that could be done. I had too much to lose. I basically retired from my work and was accepted there, and wanted to be in New York anyway. So what happened was that the professors there and students, none of them had ever heard of the Urantia Book. And this is a school where Paul Tillich taught and Reinhold Niebuhr. You would have thought they would have heard of it, but nobody did. Except I met one student who was a friend of Angela Thurston at Harvard, and he had heard of it, but he had become a Buddhist. So I was alone in this little endeavor. I wanted folks to know, and I just inserted this very quickly, this is a book on epigenetics, which I published as the last thing I published before I retired. It's on more on the sort of the health side of epigenetics, and I actually ghost wrote it for this author, but it's very introductory. So one introduction to these issues, you can see it here with reference to lifestyle change and epigenetics, and it's getting to be a very exciting industry. So this is the mascot of our talk. This is the frog that was our ancestor that is referred to. It says, you have been informed that Urantia mortals evolved by way of primitive frog development, and that this ascending strain carried in potential in a single frog narrowly escaped extinction on a certain occasion in paper 65. And just after it makes that statement, it says, but we had 1,000 other strains we were looking at the same time. Now I want to bring in one of the parts of the predicament that I think biological evolution presents to us, particularly us who are philosophical, who are Urantia Book readers, and who are interdisciplinary. So I'm trying to invoke here an interdisciplinary look at the issue of biological evolution. So we're not just looking at the science, the hard science, but also philosophic issues, theological issues, and the interaction of these things. And this notion of theodicy, which was the main subject of the book I'm working on, is broken down into three parts which were first suggested by Leibniz in the 18th century, 17th century. First, there was something they call metaphysical evil, and then second, moral evil, and then third, natural evil. Natural evil is what we're going to talk about. So it's really about the problem of natural evil. Metaphysical evil has to do with the fact that we're finite. And so being finite beings with an infinite father, we're not yet perfected. And that idea was not really played out so much in theology as much as moral evil, which of course is in a way the biggest problem in at least in Christian thought, is the problem of morality. And in the teachings of Jesus, of course. And moral evil is the basic subject of the work of theodicy. And theodicy is the subdiscipline in theology, which says that how is it possible that there's so much evil and sin on the planet, given that our Father God, our Creator God, is good, is benevolent, omnibenevolent, and is omnipotent. How could an all-powerful, all-loving God permit or allow so much evil and sin that we see all around us? And this became the obsession of Saint Augustine in the 4th century, who picked up this issue of moral evil that was very strong among the disciples, apostles of Jesus, who, after all, witnessed the horrific execution of Jesus. And the problem of a demonic presence was something that they were hyper aware of in the early centuries. So St. Augustine made this into a theodicy problem, and they didn't call it that back then. But his brilliant work is an effort to encompass this, but without knowing anything about evolution. So now we're going to segue from that to what I consider to be the predicament that we're working on, the predicament of evolution, in particular biological evolution. And there are 4 elements to this. One is this question of natural evil, which I brought up, which is, again, evil in the sense that it's unconscious. So the animal world is devouring one another, but it isn't out of malice. It's the way they're instinctively programmed for survival. So this is considered to be a form of evil, but it's unconscious or natural evil. But it does pose a huge problem in philosophy and theology, which has become very prominent in theology. I was surprised to find that the inquiry into the problem of what they call animicity, the animal world and its vicissitudes, and why it is that there would appear to be a design of evolution in which animals suffer and are victims of predation. So that's the first part of this predicament. The second part of this predicament is how we understand evolution, particularly in view of Darwinian concepts, that chance and serendipity is essential in Darwinian theory. And we'll return to that a lot after this. Third is the issue of design. Is there design and purpose in evolution? And that's the theological question. But it's also a question for science, because science can maybe identify the design features in evolution, but there's an awful lot of controversy about that. And finally is the predicament that prior to the Urantia revelation, we didn't have revelation about these questions, but now we're going to look at what the Urantia book says. Before I read these questions, I do want to give you a kind of a disclaimer. I was one of those people in high school and college who was a humanities guy, and I'm not a trained scientist, but I did spend a lot of time in the theology of science. So that's kind of the source of these questions. So I'll read these to you. And this again is on the question of natural evil, which is part of the theodicy endeavor. Number 1, if God is our all-loving and all-powerful creator, why does evolution require millions of years of predation, animal suffering, and species extinction, including the current possibility of human extinction? And I want to note parenthetically that most of you probably know that species extinction is a very big part of this process, because more than 99% of all species have disappeared, have gone extinct in the history of evolution on Urantia. Question two. Now we're going to state this another way. Does the omnipotent God of love permit millennia of such pain and death of the species, including the human species, for the sake of some greater good? What is that greater good? Now, we as Urantia Book readers have a good idea about that. We'll return to that soon. Three, a question of why in this equation, in this discussion, why is there so much room for apparent randomness? This is not a deterministic universe, right? So why is there so much room for apparent randomness and such a huge role for unpredictable genetic mutations or chance, and also for chance events of so-called natural evil, like the asteroid that may have destroyed the dinosaurs over 60 million years ago? These are chance events that really significantly affect evolution, and they're totally out of the blue. Fourth question, it kind of flows from the others. Theologically speaking, does the Creator identify somehow with and experience somehow the suffering, the inevitable suffering and death of his lowly creatures through these eons of evolution, as well as the suffering of humans? Certainly we know that there's an empathic participation with humans, but what about animals? This is a key question for many theologians today. Now, with these questions in mind, I make a couple of assertions that I want to present to you kind of up front, which is that just as evolution is a fitful blend of chance, that is natural contingencies, punctuated by divine purpose, the problem of natural evil and the resulting suffering of God's creatures is itself also encompassed by a divine design. So that's actually my answer to the questions that I just posed. And I call this the UB's architecture of managed evolution. The UB, reading down below, the UB reveals a grand architecture of managed evolution, one that must accommodate unpredictable wildcards, such as random genetic mutations and even planetary rebellions, but makes full provision for moving through every possible contingency, all in due time, actually over billions of years. So let's turn for a moment to Adam and Eve, and I want to kind of press home a distinction, which is very strong in Christian thought and in Urantia Book theology, which is there's a sense in which, very strong sense, in which we are coming up from Eden. And in Christianity, this is known as by some theologians as the original blessing that we were given at creation. And this has come down into liberal Christianity, what we call liberal Christianity. But then the alternative to that is we descended down, we're coming down from paradise, that is from Eden. And this is the original sin notion that we get from St. Augustine, passed down in Catholic thought and Orthodox thought, in fundamentalist thinking and preaching. And now that term has been moved over to the notion of original selfishness, which we'll get into. And this is one of the assumptions of what we call Christian realism. And here are two exemplary theologians, very much worth knowing about. Walter Rauschenbusch, who died about 100 years ago, was the originator of the social gospel theology, but he built on liberal notions of theology of the 19th century. And this culminated in many of the authors that are human sources to the Urantia Book. The Urantia Book should be known and understood to be a product of liberal thought in Christianity, which is more optimistic. These are folks that are more optimistic about human nature, And so this brings us to this notion of a certain type of evil known as social sin. So these folks tend to think of evil as something that happens to us because of society, because of economic and political conditions that oppresses us. So that's why we have this notion of the social gospel, liberation theology, people like Martin Luther King. And what's happening right now, almost in front of me, is the Poor People's March here in Washington, D.C., where I am, which is a huge manifestation of this social gospel theology. And this is a very valid and beautiful way to look at the problem of evil. But the sort of the opponent to this, from Reinhold Niebuhr, and many of you may have heard of him because he was the favorite author of Barack Obama and other U.S. presidents, and is often cited for U.S. foreign policy because he was a pessimist about human nature, and he felt that we needed to contain communism, we needed to contain restless factors, forces in the world with a strong military. But Niebuhr had a very deep and thorough estimate of human nature, saying that these folks had the liberals are misleading us into being overly optimistic about human nature. And the fact of the matter is that the ancient Christians were right about original sin. However, we're not gonna buy this idea of Eden, but we are going to buy the idea that somehow sinful tendencies are built into human nature, and we should be realists about that. We should not be overly optimistic, because you'll make mistakes in policy and even in your personal life. So here's kind of one of the premises that I have in my research, which is that the Christian realism of somebody like Niebuhr is more realistic. And there are two reasons for us also as Urantia Book readers to take this seriously. One is, and I'll read this, we carry in us the selfish genes of our evolutionary forebears who prevailed in the only way possible, that is, by sometimes predatory behavior and by other amoral methods of succeeding in the struggle for survival. In each case of success in the struggle, the surviving individual, group, or species lives on to mate and produce progeny, who thereby pass these selfish genetic traits down to us. So this is really the upshot of much of evolutionary theory, and particularly is skewed somewhat by the realist view of evolution from these Christian theologians, but it's held to by lots of people who, including secularists like many of the secular genetic evolutionists really believe in this notion of the selfish gene, such as Richard Dawkins, who made it popular, and many others that speak to this issue of that the genetic inheritance of humankind is of a self-serving variety, because only those who serve themselves, and particularly who to the end of being able to find a mate, those are the ones that survive in evolution. So let's mark that well. Second, I'll read again from number 2 here, the moral and genetic consequences of the double default. This is another reason for being Christian realists or Urantia Book realists. So quoting from the UB, the Caligastia upheaval, states the UB, precipitated worldwide confusion and robbed all subsequent generations of the moral assistance which a well-ordered society would have provided. And then I kind of skipped a line or two and I added this, but even more disastrous was the Adamic default, in that it deprived the races of that superior type of physical nature, etc., which we've discussed earlier on. So these are two large reasons why a more realistic and a little bit less optimistic view is needed right now. And if we look at the world right now and the various conflicts we see around the world and in this country, I think a realist picture is a better way to go. But let's look at the science behind it. The Urantia book makes statements that make me think that they're speaking to this issue that we have an inheritance of natural evil such that there's a kind of original selfishness. We won't call it original sin, we'll call it original selfishness. And of course, that's Cain and Abel, painting of that. But the Urantia book at page 68 says some things that are very stark. It says, civilization is not biologically inherent. Second, it says cooperation is not a natural trait of man. And third, it says, pretty much on the first page of that paper, group hostility, personal suspicion, and other highly antisocial traits are characteristic of all primitive races. So this is the inheritance of biological evolution passed down to us. It's one way to frame it. There are, of course, many other ways. So we really come out with two propositions here. One is that evolution produces what I will call original selfishness, which we get from conservative theology. And two is evolution is a benign force leading to unending progress, which is liberal theology. And you notice in the Urantia book, we get a lot of language about progress. It is like a species of liberal theology of the 19th century, early 20th century. But I want to point out that if you study the history of theology, you find that the liberal theology assumptions, some of which you see in the Urantia book, were cast aside by the mainstream of theology, much of it at least, after World War I, and particularly after World War II. And Niebuhr from Reinhold Niebuhr started out as an optimist, actually. But after the war, he became a pessimist and a conservative. It's known as neoconservative theology, and this survives today in right-wing Christianity and Christian nationalism. Evolution produces original selfishness, yes. We can show that with the science. But also evolution is a benign force leading to progress. Yes, that's true too. Both are true. But we need to solve this problem at a higher level. And that's one of the functions of current philosophy and theology, reflecting on the problem we're talking about today. And I'm going to give you a couple examples. These are books that I've used in my research. The one on the right is by my main professor and reader in theology. And this is his effort to do a kind of a synthesis of these two propositions. There's sort of a downside in which there are sinful tendencies in evolution that are obvious, but there's the upside that what he calls grace-filled naturalism. And then there's Ted Peters, and some of you may have heard of Ted Peters. He co-founded the Center for Science and Theology. It's actually the Center for Natural Sciences and Theology at GTU Berkeley. And Ted Peters got exposed to the Urantia book by many of us that went through Berkeley. And he came to find it worth looking at. And I went back to him years later after taking a course with him and invited him to speak about the Urantia book at a conference I held in 2014. And you can see that video at my YouTube site. Ted Peters has grappled with the Urantia book and found it impressive. And it may have influenced this book, which he wrote in 2019. I can't really tell, but he already was at the position of the Urantia book before he began to read it. And he basically told me that in terms of this big synthesis that we're talking about. And this is the attempt to fill in gaps between science and religion, using philosophy or philosophic theology. This is what the Urantia book is pointing to and doing a lot of. But because these people don't have the Urantia book, they're doing what the Urantia Book does. They're doing this interdisciplinary synthesis. So I find it very interesting and significant. Here are a couple of other examples. There's this Harvard theologian, Gordon Kaufman, now deceased, but very important thinker, who said that God infuses evolution with the unfathomable spirit of serendipitous creativity, a dynamic divine energy that undergirds the surprising novelty that results from spontaneously occurring genetic variation. And second, Karl Rahner, you may have heard of this great Catholic. He says, God infuses creation as its Shekinah that pressures it from within to evolve. And this is this ancient Jewish notion of a kind of feminine deity force that's immanent, that's actually indwelling, and that he takes it out of the realm of ancient Greek philosophy, which is all static, there's no evolution. And he says, no, this is actually pressuring evolution to evolve. And these are some of the better concepts that we're getting from these thinkers that are on really the cutting edge of science, theology, dialogue. But now let's turn to the Urantia Book and what it says. The Urantia Book doesn't need to have these nebulous ideas, as interesting as they are, that there's this force, this spirit, which is driving evolution. It's known as the first cause. They call it a following Aquinas. There's this causal factor, which is the divine spirit, which is causing creation, and then which is continually causing the unfolding of evolution. So these are wonderful concepts, but it's nothing like what we have. And it's startling to read these things back to back, which I've been doing, which is that the Urantia Book says that evolution has governance. Okay, it's not just, it's guided by the spirit, but there's management, celestial management on the ground. Let me read this to you. It says, we discover that deity is not just a dynamic divine energy, as Kaufman teaches, but is operationally engaged through the subordinate beings and agencies. This is a stupendous revelation, in my estimate, this is me writing, that helps us reframe the many issues we are considering in terms of the architecture of managed evolution. This is special divine action, is creative in the broadest sense, and it's at first carried out by previously unrevealed celestial groups. And I won't read the rest of this, but you can see the equation. It's master physical controllers, 7 master spirits, and life carriers. And the sort of the governance of life begins with life implantation. And these agencies are carefully managing what they call pre-mind life. And of course, certainly when mind begins to bud, we have the 7 master spirits kicking in. So now what does the Urantia Book say? The Urantia Book says the subsequent process is sustained by a ruthless, sometimes, this is me writing, sorry about that, is a ruthless and sometimes ravenous urge of life. That's more or less how many evolutionists describe biological evolution. Stephen Jay Gould, for example, states this, unequivocally in his writings, that the urge of life is ruthless, it's self-centered, it has to be by necessity, otherwise you don't survive, you don't pass on your genes, and you will not have an inheritance that comes down to us. So this is a self-oriented urge of life that sometimes is, and very often is, ravenous. But the UB describes the bigger picture behind this impulsive life or impulsive evolution in terms of creator intent, and offers us more idealistic terminology. Let me read it to you. There is original endowment of adaptation in living things and beings. In every living plant or animal cell, in every living organism, material or spiritual, there is an insatiable craving for the attainment of ever-increasing perfection of environmental adjustment, organismal adaptation, and augmented life realization. These interminable efforts of all living things evidence the existence within them of an innate striving for perfection. It's a shocking statement, really, in my view, to apply to early life, pre-mind life. But this is what Revelation is telling us is really what's behind this insatiable craving that the scientists all observe and that Darwin certainly wrote about. One of the great Darwinists that I found is Darrell Domning. As a biologist turned theologian, he asserts that this primal selfishness has its origin in the farthest depths of evolutionary time and is the mechanics of the process itself. And it's Domning that was kind of the spirit of this essay that I've written, because he takes us from the biblical original sin idea to the science-based idea of what he calls original selfishness. And a lot of this comes down to the notion of predation and animal suffering that we see as we watch nature shows on TV, for example. Carnivores cause a lot of pain and suffering to their prey. Parasites can destroy their prey. There's cannibalistic animals as well. So these are facts of science. Here's a depiction of predation, showing grass at the bottom and slugs that eat grass, rabbits that eat grass, insects that eat grass, but then all the above become prey to moles. Moles are eating insects. So everything at the bottom is prey to things at the top, and you have a lot of predation here. So when we get to human evolution, in the light of this notion of the insatiable urge of life, what do the life carriers tell us? They tell us things that I find fairly surprising, because I was brought up in a liberal theology view of things. But they give you this sense of human nature as pretty ruthless in the beginning. There's one statement that says, the life carrier plants anticipated the incessant, relentless wars of extermination as were waged by the red, green, and orange man. And there's another statement in the next paper. The appearance of primitive man on Earth during the Ice Age was not just an accident, it was by design. The rigors and climatic severity of the glacial era fostered the production of a hardy type of human being with tremendous survival endowment. So here we go again with managed evolution. This is not just chance. They are arranging conditions so that a certain type of human being can be produced. Civilization, according to the Urantia Book, is not biologically inherent. Cooperation is not a natural trait of man. Group hostility, etc., are all characteristic of the primitive races. So let's look a little bit at Darwin and get some of the hard science behind this. Darwin got much of this right, because in essence, he says that genetic variations, he didn't use the term genetics, that wasn't far enough along yet, but variations and speciation, as he called it, favors survival. And these variations are the ones that are selected. There are two elements of this that nobody doubts: random mutation and natural selection. There are other elements, such as what we discussed earlier, which is epigenetic factors. And as discussed earlier, there's such a thing as transgenerational epigenetic inheritance. This comes much later in the discussion. And the opponent of Darwin seems to have been exonerated. That was Lamarck, who said that experience also conditions our survival as well. But fundamentally, nobody disagrees that there's this randomness of mutation, and then nature acts upon the variations that are produced randomly and by chance in the genetic endowment of an individual. So let's go over this. You got two big elements: genetic mutation, natural selection. Genetic mutation is the driver, and natural selection selects the better variants that have more survival value. And again, today, no one doubts that evolutionary adaptation occurs because of these two elements. Natural selection now offers the most plausible mechanism for evolutionary adaptation, while the occurrence of random genetic variations across a large population could be identified as the engine of change. Biologists now know exactly how and why chance alterations occur, and we also know that the environment itself naturally selects for survival those individuals best able to compete based on their particular mutation. The ultimate outcome is self-perpetuation, mating, because of these selfishly adaptive behaviors. Now let's segue back to evolutionary theologians. Here's one I like very much. And here's a new point having to do with the role of chance. I'm going to read this quote to you. It's not easy, so we'll go slowly. Might it not be said that such spaces populated by billions of galaxies, he's looking at current cosmology, such spaces populated by billions of galaxies that have developed over billions of years may have been needed in order that in a natural way, the cosmos might give birth somewhere within it to human life, one time or maybe multiple times. The contingency of the single evolutionary line may thus overcome the immensity of the cosmic scale. The Urantia Book has a reply to that, which is the following: cosmic evolution may not always be understandable, that is predictable, but it is strictly non-accidental. There is a precise system, a universal law, which determines the unfolding of planetary life on the spheres of space. So we have two models here. One is, I think, a very valid view that life appears more or less unplanned, spontaneously, but it's very unlikely to occur. It's occurring by chance. But if you have billions of galaxies, it's going to appear somewhere and more than one place. So this is current thinking. And this is called the swamping of contingency. But we Urantia Book readers have this notion of managed evolution, which is that the divine agencies of life are lawful, and to a large extent, they manage the process and they plant life where they think it has the best chance. So my conclusion is that there's a subtle flexibility in the UB's paradigm of cosmic evolution. It is not strictly deterministic, because certain unpredictable factors may at times bend or even break the laws of evolution. Lucifer and his cohorts were lawbreakers, according to this definition, I would speculate. The asteroid that destroyed much of life was another such wild card. So what we need to sort of put together is this koan, which we just read. Evolution is both unpredictable and non-accidental. How do we get that? How do we put that together? This is a paradox that the Urantia Book calls us to contemplate. Very important, maybe not emphasized enough in this discussion that I presented, is that evolution is not just implanted, not just conditioned through the early stages, but that advanced forms of life appear suddenly. And you see that over and over again in those papers, if you remember, that they italicize appeared suddenly to get it across to us that this is something that's programmed. But this is an idea that is hard for today's theorists to accept, but it has to be revealed. Here's one of the statements. The higher protozoan type of animal life appeared suddenly. The greatest single leap was executed when the reptile became a bird. Big leap. From the agile little reptilian dinosaur, the placental mammals suddenly sprang. There's a big one. And then a couple in the highlands of India began suddenly to produce a family of unusually intelligent children. That being, of course, the first Sangic family. So what I want to end with is to get across that there are elements of chance, contingency that are obvious because of the scale of the universe. That the Creator Father needed a vast scale on which to allow chance to operate, so that there could be diversity, so that there could be what biologists call speciation, all kinds of beings, and experimenting on experimental planets with very special new kinds that somewhat by chance may appear. And a lot of it is very contingent, because the leap from a reptile to a bird, well, the characteristics of these reptiles would be different on some other planet with a different environment. So the genetics of a reptile on another planet giving birth to a bird would look very different. So there's great diversity, which is why we have chance in evolution, and why we have so many billions, trillions of inhabited planets. But there's management of this in the fact that there must have been implanted in the life carrier designs the ability for the sudden appearance of forms intervening between, say, reptiles and birds. And this is one of the great debates today, is where are the transitional forms? Darwin said there should be gradual transitional evolution, but it's really not working out that way in current biological evolution. What we're finding is what Stephen Jay Gould said, which is punctuated equilibrium. It's the notion that there's a purpose in that the contingent chancy process is punctuated by something programmed into the genetic potential. And he called that punctuated equilibrium. However, Stephen Jay Gould, perhaps the greatest evolutionary biologist of the last period, who died 20 years ago, he didn't think that this was proof of purposiveness. That's another discussion for another time. But I want to pull it all together with this final slide. We ask to be delivered from original selfishness, because the legacy of biological evolution is, yes, driven by a drive to perfection, but because of the deficits we have from the double default, number one, and from the fact that millions of years of animal evolution are driven by a kind of selfishness. Sounds like a metaphor, but to a large extent, it is self-centered activity, mainly unconscious, conditioned by the by the 5 adjutant mind spirits. But this is the legacy that comes to us, combined with, again, the deficits from the double default, which add up to the fact that we need special divine guidance, divine intervention, revelatory texts, which would be able to deliver us and to provide a kind of salvation from our genetic and epigenetic inheritance. So let me read this to you. The deliverance from the destructive power of original selfishness must be produced by special divine action. Jesus appears on earth to teach us to modify our stubborn selfishness for the sake of higher values. We need to be saved from the selfish way of life that natural selection enforces, as the theologian Dawkins puts it. Numerous gospel passages repeat the theme that we are no longer to favor the strong over the weak, kin over non-kin, and self above others. We must defy it outright by following the selfless example of Jesus. Ultimately, we are called by Jesus to defy the laws of Darwinian evolution and the very natural processes that allowed us to take dominion over the earth in the first place.
Thank you, Byron. That was a very informative talk. Gard is there and Phil's coming on. Gard, do you want to start off?
Byron, well done, as always. You are a brother, and really appreciate it. My question to you is, probably next to the Bible, the greatest source for the revelators was a book called The Science of Society. You may be familiar with it. Sumner and Keller, who were the sort of fathers of American sociology. The book refers to us being dual origin creatures, biological origins and divine destiny, right?
Right.
And when I teach my classes, I actually suggest to them that selfishness is actually not a bad thing. It's actually a part of the divine design. And Sumner and Keller talk about the institutions of culture. So the institutions of self-preservation, the institutions of self-reproduction, the institutions of self-gratification, which, using the words of Thomas Keating, the instinct of security and survival, the instinct of esteem and affection, the instinct of power and control. So those are sort of biologically implanted in us. And I'm thinking of Matthew Fox's work, that this apparent evil actually is not evil. As I tell my students, you wouldn't be here 500 million years of evolutionary history if you didn't have those instincts operative. So we can say thank you for those instincts and not look at them so much as propensities or evil. So I'm just curious as to your reflection, again, how those instincts actually translate into the institutions of society or civilization, and how those instincts might be viewed not so much as evil, but as managed evolution, as you said earlier so well, and that they're actually original blessing, not original deficiency.
You too are quite the theologian, Gard, because that's the theological question that I address in the book that I've been working on now for 3 years, which is just one slice of it has to do with biological evolution, but it really plays out a lot in the theological reflection on this, because as I mentioned, the sort of the pessimists or the realists see these things as that there's evil as real, relatively real, versus the liberals who would say, well, no, we need to be optimistic about human nature because these things are conducing themselves to higher levels of culture, through vicissitudes that we all suffer. And so the reason I hope or want to stress more the realist view is really because of the impact of the Lucifer rebellion and the deficit, the genetic deficit, because of the fact that the material son and daughter largely failed, so that it dawned on me sort of late in life, after being an optimist, that I really got to take this more serious, and that so the optimism that we see a lot in the Urantia Book itself, that I think is another factor that is conditioned by the time in which it was written and the sources that they use, the human sources, because it preceded the advent of neoconservative theology, by just a short time. And so by post-World War II, people weren't talking the way the Urantia Book does, really, in theology. And so we need to factor all of these things in this. So, the notion, for example, that evil is not really real because it conduces to greater goods. And the Urantia Book says, for example, that the Lucifer rebellion, if you added up the good, it's 1,000 times the evil, right? It was a very, very stark statement that that theodicy could have a hard time with. Theodicy would say, for example, the people that are contemplating the issue of what we call horrendous evil, genocidal evil, Hiroshima, etc., Holocaust. They say we can't talk like that anymore. We have to take this more seriously. And in that light is why one reason Reinhold Niebuhr, made his name and reputation by switching sides from optimism to realism. So I would say it's a framing issue and somewhat rhetorical. I use this notion of evil rhetorically in order to draw attention that we need to the scientific underpinnings of this debate, because what I see in the scientific literature as an amateur really is this emphasis on, from Stephen Jay Gould, where he says over and over again, hey, people, this is self-interested behavior. This drives everything. If it didn't, it couldn't happen because you wouldn't pass on your genes to progeny. So don't get moralistic about it. It just is what it is. But it actually works because there's this evolution. However, he even denied evolution, you may know. He said it's just going different directions randomly, and it appears that good things are happening. So he says we can't say that's up to religion to say that. That's up to social science to say that. We don't say that. But is production of greater goods enough? Is that enough reason for the so-called evils that we're talking about, the suffering? I would just rather leave it as an open question for inquiry. And that's why I think that Urantia Book readers should be in dialogue with these academics. I mean, it's not easy because you get in trouble. And
one of the people that is in dialogue, and he's here, and Phil, if it's okay with you, Stephen Finlan is one of our master theologians in our community. His work on the atonement I recommend to everybody, and I know you've read it, Byron. But Steve, do you have any comments on what Byron's been sharing?
I guess one thing that occurred to me was the planned evolution seems to show up in these mutations. All the Sangiks emerged in one family, but they knew that the Sangik, the colored races, they knew the 6 colored races were going to emerge. Right. And I think they knew that these other sudden genetic advances were going to occur. So it shows more mindedness behind evolution than current science is willing to admit. Right. Now, I see a necessity for retaining both optimism and realism, really. The so-called optimism of the Urantia Book is really the spiritual focus of the book, has to do with spiritual progress, has to do with religion being the only hope for peace between the races, has to do with the spirit of truth being a gift for all humanity, not just for Christianity. And so you could call those things optimistic, I guess. They are. But I don't think they have to be they'll be realistic about how much evil there is. Nationalistic evil, imperialistic evil going on right now with Russia's aggressive attack on Ukraine and possibly on other nations to come. So we do have to be realistic about the evil that's out there. But our gospel message is profoundly optimistic.
Thank you. Thank you very much. See you too. And
I've got a question from Brad Garner wanted to say, When there is so much good truth to publish and proclaim, why should man dwell so much upon the evil in the world just because it appears to be a fact? Can you reflect on the phrase appears to be a fact?
One of the many statements about evil in the text. I mean, it's ranges between statement of evil as fact and then what I actually say in the book that I'm working on now. I have 2 chapters on the Urantia Book, and it's, I guess, one of the first treatments of the Urantia Book in an academic text, where I state that the Urantia Book has a whole range of ideas about evil, and it actually has a little bit of St. Augustine, it has a little bit of, it has both conservative and liberal, as I've framed it, and it states that evil is relatively real when we think in terms of the supreme. The supreme is our way of, or its way of bringing forward one of the modern insights, is that evil is, it is not what the ancients said, that evil is just an appearance. We're like Hinduism, it's just Maya. That is not the view of the Urantia Book. The Urantia Book does not think of it as an illusory reality. The regime under which we live within the Supreme is one of where there are evils and suffering that is built into the process. And if you have a double default, you have much more of it. And so this is the issue that I think that I prefer to bring forward at this time, rather than the optimistic, simply because so that people can get more grounded in the issues we face today. And but that's why the Urantia Book allows us a lot of room, a lot of berth for saying both sides rather than one side.
Okay, we have another sort of statement and then a question from Josh Wilson. The benefits of human warfare have declined over the millennia. Is every military conflict in 2022 to be completely condemned?
Yeah, the UB talks about the social value of war. Really an interesting passage. And there's not too many theodicists that would say that. Actually, Hegel said it, actually. But he was not even, he was just a philosopher. But yeah, I think it's to be condemned today because it's part of the inheritance, really the biological inheritance of man, to be suspicious, to be antisocial, to not be cooperative. That leads to warfare. And the UB says, we anticipated that the races were going to commit genocide, right, against one another. That's built into the plan. The so-called managed plan is managed in such a way that there's genocides in primitive times. But there's no excuse for it today, except for the legacy of the Lucifer Rebellion, which we, which we see coming down in right-wing Christianity, right? This emphasis on sin and on the devil, right? They're trying to bring forward this truth against the liberals. So I think that war is to be condemned unequivocally, and the Urantia Book gives us the way to stop war through world federation, but we've not achieved it. I'm in the office I'm in right now. I work for the World Federalist Association, and they're having a rough time getting the word out. I'm actually in their office here in Washington, D.C., where I work. It's not working. They're not able to prevent war, so it needs to be condemned. But it's but we don't have at the moment a way to stop it, and it would almost call for a divine intervention.
Nia Emerson Chase says, if evil is simply being out of divine pattern, how do the UB references to evil, sin, and iniquity relate to evil in relation to evolution and soul ascension?
So the evil being out of divine pattern is a metaphor that's helpful. But I think of it as a little different. I think of it as something that occurs through free will. And there isn't a particular pattern for decisions you make day to day. It's something that takes into account multiple factors. So I don't know about pattern per se, but But what's the second half of the question? Read that back.
Well, she was speaking that evil is not part of the divine pattern of good, I guess. And then so the UB reference to sin, evil, and iniquity relate to, quote, evil in relation to evolution and soul ascension. In other words, I think she's kind of asking, do we actually need evil for soul ascension? In other words, do we need to actually experience it to be able to grow our souls enough to go on?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's a huge question, but we don't need to have firsthand experience with evil and sin. We can get it secondhand, as I think the UB says. But the fact of the matter is, it's present, ever present in the front page of the paper every day. Of course, that's secondhand, but it's very hard, as Gard was pointing out, to avoid trauma in this life. So a lot of us have a lot of trauma. And so again, there's a kind of denialism that comes with more the optimistic view, which is, well, it's really not that bad because greater things are coming, greater goods are produced from the evil. And I don't think that is really correct if you have a teaching about evolutionary deity, right? So ancient Christianity said evil's not really real. It's just, you just missed the mark, but it's an illusion. And it wasn't until we had evolution in the picture and the supreme being in the picture that we could say, well, yeah, evil is something that is real in the sense that it's changing lives, traumatizing, wrecking entire, races, cities. That is, and it's a gift in a sense that we come from a rebellion planet, and this is soul making in its effect, right? So the soul making aspect of evil is a good thing, but we don't want to be in denial of particularly the trauma that weaker or marginalized groups and races. We need to acknowledge these things as adversity.
Conrad, would you like to make your comment, please?
Well, in Christian theology, there's a concept of original sin, which they use to explain reasons why the world, there's so much evil and disharmony in the world. You don't have that concept in the Urantia Book. The Urantia Book, however, tell us that we live in a world of imperfection, in an evolutionary universe. And they talk about Havona as being the universe of central and eternal perfection. So beings in Havona are perfect inherently. However, when we're in an evolutionary universe, there's potentials that are being actualized progressively, and it is as if we were living in a kind of big scaffolding, and there's all sorts of inharmonies and imperfections. Currently, we're at the level of maximum imperfection, but our destiny is to reach the perfection of our universal Father. So what it seems they indicate in the Urantia Book is that through the process of evolution, we are co-evolving a new type of creature, and we will acquire evolutionary perfection. That the universe and the world in which we live, with its inharmonies and imperfections, is the arena of choice. So since we have free choice, some people will decide, will follow the path of evil, others will follow the path of the Father's will, but it boils down to free choice. It seems to me that that's the key element, but also the fact that we, through evolution, every quality, divine quality that we acquire is a personal acquirement, and that will differentiate us from the beings of Havona. That's an interesting perspective that we see in the Urantia Book, and to me, it seems to be unique to the Urantia revelation.
Yeah, thank you very much. What I'm trying to bring forward the biological foundation of the things you're just talking about. That was a challenge for me, because I'm more of a thinker like you are. I think that of the big picture, humanities, philosophy, theology. But what I want to hope that people come away from this, and I hope that you do read my essay. It's a lot better than my talk, I think. That the biological basis of this is something not to be underestimated because biology has no other way of progressing without this insatiable, self-centered urge for life and propagation. Millions and millions and millions of years of this come down. Secondly, adding the double default on top of that, so that we can talk philosophically about it. But the reason we have this important debate between science and theology is when I'm trying to bring that forward, is saying this is important. The Urantia Book already had this thing kind of handled, and now the theologians are catching up to it and saying, hey, we got to take this into account because there's this thing called natural evil, which is there's this huge suffering that's going on, and it's passed down to the humans. And look at us right now. Look at the conflicts that we're dealing with. How did this come to be? Well, we're saying it's managed, but also it's an experimental planet where a lot of things went wrong. And so there's a lot of nuances that take into account other than what, say, a liberal Christian would take into account.
Phil has a comment or a question. Go ahead, Phil.
One of the things that came to mind was, the Urantia Book says that a lot more good has come of our troubles here on this earth. When you look at it from a larger perspective, and I think so. We must be. Urantia must be teaching other worlds, what happens when a world loses what they take for granted.
Right. Yeah.
So, in a sense, gosh, there, but for the grace of God, go our world as they look at us.
Right.
So,
yeah.
Well, that's the first thing. And another thing that came to mind was that statement in there about the sex drive trick selfish man, there's that word, into making something more than an animal of himself.
Right. Yeah. Right.
Another thought I wanted to share was the statement that was at first very difficult for me to grasp. The meaning of life is its adaptability.
Right.
I said, really? Is that
Yeah,
really it?
Yeah.
Well, yeah. And the other thing is, people talk about the possibility that we're going to get a life out of, the physics and the chemistry. But adaptability will never come out of physics and chemistry. The probability of that is zero because physics and chemistry is uniform. That's what we call these laws of science for physics and chemistry. So we're never going to get life out of it.
We do have a question from the audience that's basic, but I have to say it's very good. Does the definition of theodicy change from the Urantian perspective?
Yeah, what I think it happens to the idea of theodicy with the Urantia Book is that it's an integrative view, and there's never been anything like it. It's actually kind of the thesis of the book I'm writing. It actually has all the different points of view on evil that I could find in the literature. If you spend a couple of years like I did, then you go read the Urantia Book again and say, hey, the Urantia Book has that same idea. Oh, it has that one too. It has St. Augustine's ideas in there too. And it has this notion of, I mentioned before, soul making. Soul making was something that was kind of invented by a theologian in the 1960s. It became a big movement. But the Urantia Book had already taught us about the soul and soul making as a result of our experience of adversity and evil. It has that. It has also what's called the greater goods idea, that we have all these evils, but that it's got an upside, which is greater goods are produced from the evils. It's got that too. And so it actually is an integral or integrative view of theology. So yes, the Urantia Book is a revolution in that area of theology, but you have to put it together because it doesn't have a section on that. So it takes you a long time. But once you get going, it's thrilling because It's what it does with a lot of subjects. It really has both sides of many topics. And on this issue of evil, I think that if you drill down, you'll see that evil is real, but it also is not real. Where souls are being made, but also souls are being destroyed. And so many things. There's all this chance, the chances that there would be a rebellion, 1 in a million, something like that. But it's there. So chance is a big factor. But there's also managed evolution. They're managing. Well, you have a big failure, they'll come in and fix it. But it's going to take them a long time. It's going to take them 500,000 years to have an adjudication or whatever. So I think we can conclude with the notion that this stuff is that it all works out in the end, right? That's
Right.
what managed evolution makes happen.
Ralph Zayer had raised his hand.
Yes, you referred to managed evolution, of course, a great deal. There's indication in the Urantia book that the plans inherent in DNA actually were our original plans. They're not, they didn't evolve here on the planet. They're based, for example, the changes that were made in the genetic structure as part of the decimal planet, the experimental part, so to speak, of the genetic process, were based on hundreds of thousands of procedures of actual laboratory experimentation. Yeah. And so, they were carefully worked out in detail before they were introduced here. Another interesting point is that in the reference stating about the life implantations, it's particularly in reference to the transition from plant life to animal life, that it says it unfolded gradually, but it was based on inherent plans that were part of the whole evolutionary genetic process. And it unfolded gradually, but it was all part of the original plan.
Yeah.
And the sudden appearance of a number of the different organisms that occurred along the way may very well be be a result of the Hox genes. I don't know if you're familiar with the Hox genes, but they're a very interesting group of genes that are organized differently in the DNA molecule, in which there's a so-called Hox clock that determines when they are turned on and when they're turned off. They're very much an integral part of the during infancy, during epigenetics. They're part of the epigenetic unfolding process.
Yes.
And they're actually positioned along the DNA molecule in a manner that's sequential, in that like number 1 is first in line, then number 2, and these open according to the Hox clock to lay out like the body plans, the symmetrical body that we're all used to, with 2 arms, 2 legs, 2 eyes, and so on. So there's a great deal of genetic information that's still unfolding. In fact, we're still evolving. The book makes it very clear that the human being is still evolutionary. We're still developing, new traits. We're losing our wisdom teeth, as you all know, and so forth. And so genetics is still unfolding. And I think most of us are familiar with the Flynn effect, which is almost certainly genetic in etiology. We're not altogether sure, but that's resulting in gradual improvement in mental functioning. And it seems to be occurring uniformly from generation to generation. It's the the IQ tests the scores are going up by about 10% per decade. So, so I think there's room for a lot of optimism. Optimism.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Ralph. We have a number of really good questions and notes here. Don Hess says, it seems to me that the concentration of thought so far is that selfishness has to do with self-propagation. How does that urge to power beyond self-propagation fit into the picture? For me, that flips over to evil, but go ahead.
Yeah, right. So the biological, insatiable craving
Yeah.
to survive, right? To survive by getting food, by getting access to resources that you can survive, right? So that's an insatiable craving. In itself, it's by itself, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you're also trying to propagate. That's just a side effect of the fact that you survived and that you were strong enough to find a mate and to mate with that mate. And so that's sort of a secondary effect of the fact that you survived a little bit longer than some other, it's all statistics, because, a lot of those that are mating are, most of those mating have not had any mutations, right? But just a few are, and so the statistical amount that are mutating in a more positive mutation that then propagate, it's very small, but it's enough that over millions of years, natural selection will select that mutation if it happens to be fortuitously the better form of and characteristic of the biology. So propagation is secondary, and then once you propagate it, then you can start thinking about, well, maybe the hominids will evolve, and then maybe you can have culture, and then you have these higher order issues to consider. But what we're saying, and really, even Freud and many others said, the sex instinct at bottom, propagation, is driving a lot of this and has to be taken very seriously. But it's obviously not just foundational. It's not, and it's not the only thing in the foundation.
So what about power? This thing now where we've got like just unbridled grasping of power. Have these people moved over into the area of evil, or what?
Yeah, without reference to their brothers and sisters and the need for the golden rule treatment of others and all the things that are taught in the religions, right? So all these things have to be provided by special divine action, right? More or less. Melchizedek came because even the idea of God had almost been snuffed out. So this has to be taught, from the beginning, and without it, there's a statement in the book that says if there hadn't been, if you look at the tribes in, I think, Australia, that's what the world would have looked like if there hadn't been these dispensations, these revelations. Every 40 miles, everybody has a different dialect. They're having incessant warfare. That's the natural state of man, of humankind. So, that is why revelation and religion is essential in the equation. And that's why theologians need to be brought into this discussion of biological evolution.
Right. I have to say that there have been a number of comments about how bad we need an avonal sun here, right now. Gaetan wanted to say, what is the influence of Caligastia in all the evil that is happening today? Does he still have some influence on what is happening now on the world? And if so, which manner do you think?
I've had an interesting time working with the World Federalist Association here. They don't have a sense of this issue of there being a demonic presence, right? They're secular people. And I'm trying to get across that, hey, we ought to be talking a little bit about the fact that there are dark, elites, if you want to call it, that have moved into the power vacuum on the planet because we don't have global governance. We have a UN that doesn't really do anything. So if you have a vacuum like that, a power vacuum, then people who are self-centered because of evolution. So power takes over once you've been able to propagate. Yeah, the will to power, as it were, is. But remember, this is a perversion of this instinct for perfection, right? That's implanted. Perfection is what the primitive urge is actually pointing to. But once your free will skews this and you get off track, start missing the mark in a big way, then you have, global warfare and a kind of predation of human beings on human beings.
Okay, when you say bring theologians into this discussion with the scientists, how would you like to see that evolve within the movement, within the Urantia Book community?
There's been a lot of talk about having some kind of a seminary, for example. I have written up a plan for having an independent kind of a seminary on a small scale where people are trained like I just got trained in this, and bringing in, it's a Urantia Book oriented seminary where we'd have these, but you need to think in an interdisciplinary sense, not just theology, but philosophy, science, history needs to be brought together. We need to have, honestly, it needs to be independent of any, it needs to stand on its own, as many seminaries do. Many are not independent, but it's better that it be independent and that it have its own funding base and have the opportunity to do what we're doing here, and inquiries that just go on, and training young people to think in Urantia Book terms about the problems we're facing, but with not just talking to other Urantians. They need to be in dialogue with academics. And one of my readers of my thesis is now in dialogue with me, and it's possible. She has a lot to lose by that, because it's just so off base. But she's fascinated by the things I said in my thesis, and it's not as hard as you may think. Once they see that you're sincere and that you've done some homework. So I call for that. I think we need to have graduate people, but not just for, again, just us talking to us like we're doing here, but us in dialogue with the bigger world, which takes some courage.
I agree. I've tried to make that effort when I've been over at Oxford, and trying to engage people. And if you are sincere, even if they are actually dying-the-wool agnostics or atheists, if you're sincere in what you believe and you want to hold an open dialogue. Byron, it's been a pleasure, and I am so glad, and I will hope that you and your other theological brethren, you will encourage them to participate in things, in our, it's just really important for all of us to think on get out of our silo and think on a much broader front. I think Phil would like to make one last comment, please.
You said earlier, and I've experienced it too, that even the highest academies of religion have never heard of the Urantia Book. And so should we remedy that, and how should we remedy that?
That's a question to me. Another thing I'm doing is I have a proposal to have an anthology of the best writings by Urantians that on the text, but readable by non-Urantians. So I actually got a little bit of funding from the fellowship to do this, and I put it together, and I've got a number of essays. Some are by people that are deceased, but we got some good living people. So to get that out and get it to a regular publisher, not just something I would publish, and to get that distributed to academics, that's another thing we need to do. We need to stop just writing and talking to one another. I mean, that's really it. It's pretty simple. And to step out, you kind of have to be retired first to do it. But younger people that want to come into this, we need to have their back. We need to find ways to support younger people that want to study this. Imagine being 22 years old and you want to study the Urantia Book, but you can't do it for the rest of your career. For the next 40 years, you can't refer to it, and you want to be, a journalist or an academic or a teacher. You can't do it. So we can't allow that. I think.
Phil,
So
I will say that in the interfaith world, the Urantia Book is very well known. It is amongst theologians, but as you scientists would understand, there's a certain specialization in theology as there is in science, and people kind of get a little tunnel vision sometimes. But I think this is a good idea. Maybe Byron, someday, Finney, we could do a sort of theological, we could invite some voices outside of our circle into that theological symposium.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
That's- Yeah, love it.
So I thank Byron again and Stephen for
everybody.
joining us.